My name is Sarah Turnbull, and I am here today with the McGill Philosophy Department Podcast, and we are interviewing Jenna Johnston. Welcome, Jenna. How are you?
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing really well. How about yourself?
Wonderful. Doing good today. Excited to have you. Now, Jenna, who are you? What is your story? What brought you here? Tell me a bit about your journey coming to McGill.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm from the United States. So I did my undergrad in Virginia at a super small liberal arts college, which is where I actually discovered my love of philosophy. And when I decided I wanted to continue pursuing philosophy, I honestly happened upon McGill as kind of a happy accident. But I became really interested in their master's in bioethics program because I'm very interested in applied philosophy, and McGill is super supportive of, finding different ways to integrate philosophy into your own life. So really interested in that type of environment, and I applied and now I'm here.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. And we're so glad that you're here. I'd love to hear a bit about, so you were saying your undergrad university was much smaller than McGill here in Montreal. We know McGill is a fairly large school. What was that adjustment process like for you?
I will say it was quite the adjustment process. And, I'm wrapping up my first semester here. So I think I'm still in that adjustment phase. I mean, my undergrad was about 700 students total. It was also in a much smaller city than Montreal. So coming to McGill and being in a big city has been very different. But in the same way of it being different, there's been so many great opportunities. And honestly, I've just kind of thrown myself in trying to get to know my classmates and my professors. And it's been so lovely to have such a wide variety of people to talk to who have such specific interests. And it's been honestly a great experience, if a bit different from what I'm used to.
Oh, wonderful. And I'm just curious, do you have any advice for anybody who might be thinking of coming from a smaller school to a bigger school?
Yeah, I think honestly, my biggest advice is go to office hours and talk in class. Because the nice thing about being in graduate school is that you're going to have generally smaller class sizes. A lot of times you're going to have seminars and a lot of opportunities to speak and have your voice and opinions heard. And that sort of thing is super important. And don't be intimidated. Your professors do want to get to know you. I think especially in the philosophy department, they're interested in hearing your perspectives. So, don't be afraid to put yourself out there, even if it's a little scary at first. It is ultimately worth it.
Yeah, it definitely can be scary. So it's nice to know, you're going to find comfort in putting yourself out there. And I know you were mentioning the bioethics department.
Yeah.
And also the philosophy department. What's going on here? How are the two sort of married together? How are they separate? What's your experience?
Absolutely. So the really cool thing about the bioethics program here is that, so I'm technically in two departments. I'm in the philosophy department, and then I'm also in the Department of Equity, Ethics, and Policy, or DEEP. So that basically means I have access to double the professors and double the potential people to speak to and learn about their own experiences. And the bioethics program is really interesting because it's not just philosophy students studying bioethics. We have options for people who are studying experimental medicine, law, religious studies. So my classmates in my bioethics courses, we're all coming from different walks of life. Some of us are philosophers. I have one friend who is a trauma nurse. Another person in my cohort has been a lawyer for 20 years. So we're all coming at, the same problem of bioethics from greatly different backgrounds. And I think that just makes our conversations all the more better and all the more interesting for it.
I could only wish to be a fly on the wall in the room. I'd love to hear a bit, and I'm not super familiar with what bioethics is. So could you tell me a bit about what it is?
Yeah, so this is actually funny that you ask that. My first day of my bioethical theory class, which is one of the required courses for all bioethics master's students, my professor asked us the very same thing.
Oh, excellent.
And, you put a bunch of students as their first day of graduate school into a classroom to say, oh, what is the thing that you all are studying? And the answer is, I think even after taking that class it's a little fuzzy, it's a little unclear, and that's actually one of the things I really like about it. So traditionally, bioethics was created to address problems in the medical field. It was actually the field of bioethics was created by theologians originally, and then it became more necessarily more interdisciplinary, and now is kind of, often left to the philosophers. But one of the things I like about McGill is that they are really trying to integrate all of the different perspectives back into bioethics. So traditionally, bioethics deals with issues within the medical field. Think of things like, MAID or abortion or the definition of death. But I think what a lot of our professors here at McGill and in the bioethics department is trying to like push the limits and see like what is actually considered to be bioethics. Are things like community-led research ethics considered bioethics? And like the opinion is yeah, we think that should be considered bioethics. So a lot of the focus is on the medical field, but we also are looking at issues of AI, of issues of disability studies. We've even done a couple courses on how sociology impacts, our understanding of bioethics. So it's one of those questions where the more you look into it, the more you realize it's a little bit nebulous, but I think that is honestly one of the things that has drawn me to it so much.
Yeah, and surely there's a lot of beauty in that, having all these different perspectives coming together. And if I was looking to take a bioethics class, let's just say, what kind of questions might I see being asked, or what might I be asked going into this?
Yeah, so I think it would depend. If you're taking more of like a philosophically centered class on bioethics, you'd often deal with things like abortion, medical assistance in dying, issues of, potentially things like infanticide, but also asking how should we act in the medical field? Is there an ethical theory that we should be using to apply to every problem in the medical field? Like, spoiler alert, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that sort of thing. But if you find yourself questioning maybe why we approach certain problems in the medical field a certain way, or maybe if you're interested in things like organ donation, or how do medical practitioners act and interact with their patients, and how do different fields of thought sort of interact with those questions, maybe that this could be a field you might be interested in.
Yeah, this gives like one of those recruitment ads of like, this is for you. With this in mind, what sort of opportunities could a bioethicist expect post-graduation?
Absolutely. So one of the really cool things about McGill's bioethics program, which I think does set it apart from even other programs in bioethics, is that in your first year, you have what's called a bioethics practicum. So you are placed in a setting. This could be a hospital setting. This could be a laboratory setting in which you are doing a job that a bioethicist might do. It's a little bit more maybe like an intern position. It's pretty low stress, but it gives you some real world experience. Some of my fellow cohort members are interested in becoming like clinical ethicists. So maybe like an advisory position in a hospital where you're brought really intense cases and you're then left to try and like help give guidance on how you can address that sort of thing. You could also continue in academia. I'm interested in still going on to studying philosophy post bioethics. But a lot of bioethicists find themselves sort of in research positions and hospital positions. And a lot of us also find ourselves still remaining in academia in that sense as well.
Yeah, it's nice that there's opportunities in both areas. So something for everybody. I wonder, would it be sort of a think tank situation in these hospital settings?
I think it depends. One of our professors, Professor Jonathan Kimmelman, is on a lot of research and clinical ethics committees. And he's actually often asked by the World Health Organization to come and advise on specific problems, specifically having to do with research ethics. So sometimes it might be more of a think tank. Sometimes it might be more of like hey, we have a concrete issue and you as, the clinical ethicist, we need your advice on this sort of thing. So it really sort of depends on what you're trying to go into. If it's maybe a more academic group, might be a little more think tanky, but there also are opportunities to where it's like you're in the thick of the moment and you gotta, be quick on your feet and be able to give guidance and advice in those situations as well.
Yeah. So what would navigating through, because it seems like you've pointed out, it's neatly at that intersection of philosophy and medical ethics. What does it look like to navigate between the two?
I think this is something that my friends in the program have talked about a lot because I think oftentimes there is a very philosophical emphasis within bioethics. The term bioethics tends to lean towards philosophy. But I think what the program does really well, what bioethics does really well, is it really integrates the lived experiences of people, like my friend who's a nurse, and sort of those of us like me who have been in academia, did my undergrad degree and now and right into grad school. So I often come at things from a very theoretical perspective of trying to say, can these meet in the middle? Is one more beneficial than the other in a specific circumstance? So it's a lot of exploring different schools of thought and seeing, is one going to be more beneficial maybe in this situation? Is there a set of ethical principles that are maybe more useful in a certain instance than other ones? Like, does someone need to study Kant for 4 years to be able to be a bioethicist?
Yeah.
Like, it's those sort of questions that we think about because, I think that I wouldn't be as good of a bioethicist if I hadn't had these conversations with my fellow cohort members who are, in different areas of bioethics than me. Like, there's something to be said about talking to people who work in the healthcare system, and then people who have been, like I said, lawyer for 2 decades now looking into bioethics. Like, we're going to come at problems differently, and that's, I think, a really good thing overall.
Yeah, wonderful. I'd love to ask, how do you find all of these different perspectives can converge at the end of the day? Do you find it's a bit of a challenge to bring them together, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that in more times than you would think, we actually all come to the same conclusion, which I think can be really interesting because the way that our courses, the bioethics courses, are set up, at least for the first course that is required to take, which is bioethical theory, basically every single class we have a case. We do research before coming into the class, and then we all present our research and our opinions about the case. So it's basically a 3-hour-long discussion of, 8 people saying, this is what I looked into, and this is sort of my opinion for how we should proceed with this sort of thing. And more often than not, even though we're coming at, problems from wildly different perspectives, we often all align on a lot of similar things. And I think sometimes, disagreements within bioethics often come from how we're getting to that conclusion, which then leads to really interesting discussions of, is there a best way to do it? Or is the end result the most important thing? And I think that's like a really big tension within the field because, you want to do things right, especially when people's lives are on the line. So I guess in a roundabout way to answer your question, we often, align in a lot of ways. It's sometimes just how we get to that conclusion, and the best way to do so, if there is one, is sometimes where, there's a little bit of disagreement or conflicting opinions.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense where you frame it in a way that you can see there is a lot at stake when you're dealing with people's lives on the line. And I'd love to ask, so earlier you were talking about all these different kinds of ethical theories. Could you tell me a bit about what these ethical theories are, what you might expect to hear in a bioethics class, let's say?
Yeah, so I think it's honestly very dependent on the people that are within your class. This semester, we went over a lot of main ethical theories. So we looked at, deontological ethics from Kant. We looked at a couple different forms of consequentialism. We also looked at the idea of principalism, which was actually developed for healthcare workers. And so this is what principalism basically says, is that, we should abide by 4 main principles, and it's used a lot, like I said, in healthcare settings. So these are things like the principle of autonomy, non-maleficence, and these sorts of things. So it's actually, the ethical theories that we talk about are pretty standard ethical theories. We talk about virtue ethics. It's oftentimes, how can these things be applied in different settings? Because, maybe you don't want to have to explain to nurses the intricacies of what the categorical imperative is. Is this a useful exercise? So we talk about a lot of pretty standard ethical theories, but we do it in a way that's sometimes a little different because you're often talking about the efficacy of these principles and these theories of how much study is needed for someone to understand these. And is this worth the work that goes into, being an expert in this? And also, what does being an expert mean? It feels a little strange to say, oh, me as a philosopher should 100% be the one telling nurses what to do. Well, that's their job. They have their training to do that. So I think it's a lot of trying to figure out what knowledge is going to be the most useful in guiding people to make the right decisions.
Yeah, again, I'd love to be a fly on the wall. What interesting conversations to have. If I were a first year coming into the bioethics program, would I only expect to take bioethical courses and, expect to talk about these sorts of theories? Or are there other courses I could take?
Yeah, well, this is a really great question. So in the bioethics program, every bioethics student will have to take the bioethical theory course, which we've talked a lot about, and also the practicum in the winter semester. But other than that, you will mostly be taking classes within your other department. So for me, I mainly take philosophy classes. But I have one of my cohort members is in religious studies. So she takes, the bioethics classes and then also religious studies courses. My friend who is doing experimental medicine in bioethics is taking a lot of like genetics classes. So you have consistently classes that you're all taking together as like the bioethics cohort. But I mean, next semester, I'm taking 1 bioethics class and 3 philosophy classes. So you get, I think, a really good mix of, honing in on one specific discipline, that being, philosophy or religious studies, et cetera, but also using that knowledge to then benefit your bioethical discussions.
Yeah, you're sort of philosophy shaping your bioethics, vice versa.
Absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. Have you found outside of bioethics interest in philosophy? Are you researching similar sort of bioethics things in philosophy?
Yeah, it's actually funny. One of my friends and I joke that, we sometimes have opportunities to talk about bioethics in other classes, and sometimes we don't. We just take completely different look at completely different interests. And that's one of the things I actually really enjoy, is that I love talking about bioethics. I think it's really interesting. But I think being able to take philosophy classes also allows me to pursue different interests and takes me out of like being in bioethics takes me out of the philosophy bubble. Sometimes
Sure.
being in philosophy classes takes me out of the bioethics bubble. So I really view sometimes my other courses as means to not only deepen my knowledge, but also do semester long little rabbit holes of looking into different interests and things that maybe they're not bioethics related, but things that I find really interesting and intriguing. And I think taking classes that aren't just bioethics almost gives me permission to do that, to say, I don't have to do everything related to one exact issue. I can explore a little bit more and, just hone in on my own interests and expand my horizons too.
Wonderful. So where have these rabbit holes taken you to? What are these interests?
Yeah. So in my bioethics class, I am talking about this understanding of ethical enfranchisement, which is just a means of saying, hey, we need to involve people that we're doing research on in the conversation about what should be researched. If you think about it, when a person or a group decides to do research on a community, it feels a little strange that oftentimes they're not involved in that conversation. So there's some really great initiatives being done by philosophers to say, hey, maybe we should include people in these conversations and letting them, sort of guide our research principles and what we should actually be researching. So that's something I'm really passionate about within bioethics. But I took a course on feminist theory this semester where I was able to talk about epistemic injustice and child influencers.
Oh, wow. Wonderful.
And then I'm taking a course on Spinoza where I'm talking about parasocial relationships through a Spinozistic lens. So I'm a little all over the place with my interests, but I like to try and find fun ways for philosophy to connect back to things that we see oftentimes in our everyday life, to not only make philosophy maybe a little bit more accessible, but also to try and, put words and language and vocabulary to describe some of the things we're seeing in our everyday lives.
Yeah, and it sounds like a very colorful experience. You're getting to dip your toes in a little bit of everything. Now, I'd love to go back to your bioethics research for a second. Could you tell me a bit about what this research looks like, the specifics of it? Where is it taking you?
Yeah, so I will say I'm at the very beginnings of this research. I'm actually going to be working under Professor Phoebe Friesen next semester as a research assistant.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So if anyone is interested in that sort of thing, I would highly recommend checking her work out because bioethics is such an interesting field because it is so deeply connected to the communities that it deals with. I think it's one of those things where it's both an academic field, but also the decisions you make and what you're learning about is very much people's real lives. And I think in that sense, bioethics has a really great opportunity to really connect with the communities that it's working with. But I think sometimes there's this divide, and I'm sure this could be said for other disciplines as well, between the experts and the public. And I think that divide can be incredibly harmful. And there's this idea that, the public should trust the experts. But when you think about it, there's a lot of people and communities who have been deeply harmed by, the medical community, the research community, where, sometimes skepticism is very well earned. And the response shouldn't be, oh, you should trust us. Like, we know more. The response should be, let's find ways to repair that trust. The burden should be on those who are, the ones in that position of power to take those steps to do so. So that's sort of the work I'm really interested in doing, and finding ways to go back to communities and not just say, oh, well, we want your opinion to, check off a box, but like, no, we deeply value your insights about like your life and your community. And that should be the guiding force for us rather than us telling you what you should be doing all the time.
Yeah, the presumption of knowledge there seems really, really dangerous. So it's wonderful work that you're doing. And might I ask, is there certain communities in particular you're interested in?
So again, I'm very much stumbled into this field by virtue of, doing my own research for class and going, wow, this is like kind of a big problem that we should be talking about. But Professor Friesen does a lot with Indigenous communities here in Canada. So I might be helping her with that. I'm just more so interested in, really finding my footing within this field. So I don't have a specific, group of communities I'm looking at yet. I might follow in her footsteps and see where I can support her work with Indigenous communities here. But, I might find a foothold somewhere else and somewhere else to explore.
Yeah, but it's wonderful you're at the point where you have options to go in a million and one different directions. And now shifting focus, you also said you were taking a feminist theory course.
Yeah.
Love to hear a bit about the work that you were doing here.
Yeah, which I absolutely loved this course, by the way. Professor Natalie Stoljar is wonderful, gives amazing feedback, and we've had some really excellent conversations in that class. So we talked a lot about this idea of silencing and epistemic injustice from Miranda Fricker, which not really heard a bad word about Fricker's work on this. She kind of hit the nail on the head with this sort of theory. So I was really interested in looking at child influencers or kidfluencers, because there's a really growing kind of bizarre phenomenon of we're seeing just like kids online. And I think there's a lot of harm being done there. And I'd done some research a couple years ago on this sort of thing, and taking this class, talking about, harming someone in their position as a knower. Like, I think there's something to be said about like how we treat children and putting them in the position of an influencer could be really interesting to examine. So that's what I ended up doing.
Oh, wonderful.
Looking at, how children are often dismissed, but then put in the position of an influencer where they're disproportionately believed, but also, looking at issues of consent online. Can children who are young as 3 who don't understand what being posted to the internet means, like actually meaningfully consent to being an influencer, and sometimes then being the breadwinner for their entire family. So there's like a lot of, social issues there, financial issues there, legal issues, but I really enjoyed taking the time to look at, hey, I think there's an epistemic issue here as well that, maybe putting it into words, like exactly what harm I think these children are experiencing, maybe can give us a better understanding of how to actually try to be proactive and protect them, as opposed to being reactive and being like, wow, I guess that was really harmful, but nothing we can do about it now. Like actually trying to solve these problems and not do so in a way that's like, oh, we're backpedaling now because now it's so bad we can't do anything about it.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned epistemic injustice.
Yeah.
Could you walk me through a bit about what that is?
For sure. So in short, like Miranda Fricker in 2007 wrote this really great book on epistemic injustice, which just basically means that in some way someone is being harmed in their ability to know things. Mm-hmm. So there's 2 main forms. There's testimonial injustice, where someone is dismissed in what they're saying because of some aspect of their social identity. You could think of an example of like, maybe you're a woman in a philosophy class and you're the only woman in a group of men, and your ideas are consistently dismissed, not because you're wrong, but because you're a woman. Mm-hmm. That would be an instance of testimonial injustice where, you're not being listened to. You're saying, oh, you can't know this. You can't be correct because of your social identity. Now, in all likelihood, you're probably very well equipped to say those things in a philosophy class, but that dismissal is saying you can't know this because of who you are is one instance of an epistemic injustice. The other is known as a hermeneutical injustice, which means that you, due to a lack of collective understanding about an issue. You don't have the vocabulary to make yourself intelligible to other people, especially describing your own experiences. I think Fricker's example she talks about in her book sort of explains it best. She talks about this woman named Carmita Wood, who was unfortunately sexually harassed at her workplace, but she didn't have the language to describe it as sexual harassment. So she eventually quit her job, but didn't have the framework to express what had happened to her as sexual harassment. So she said she left work for personal reasons. And it wasn't until afterwards when we were able to, develop the vocabulary to describe sexual harassment, then we realized that's what was happening to her. And she wasn't quitting the job for personal reasons. There was a real concrete thing that was happening to her. But because she didn't have this understanding, she didn't have this vocabulary. And at that point, because I believe this was the 1950s, that wasn't language that the community possessed in order to describe those things. Miss Wood was also deeply harmed in her ability to know and understand this experience that she had. So that's like a super brief overview of sort of epistemic injustice, but it's a way to describe the harms that come to someone in their ability to know and make themselves intelligible to other people.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, A+ answer. No, that's very helpful. And now I'd love to hear, so when you were talking about this showing up in your child influencer research, so like your sort of JoJo Siwas of the world. How do you see these two types of injustices showing up?
Absolutely. So I think, ironically, when I started this paper, I was like, the testimonial injustice, that's going to be so easy. It's going to be really easy to conceptualize this. And then I got started and I was like, actually, I'm going to start with hermeneutical injustice because it's actually a lot easier, at least in my case, to talk about that and when it comes to children. Because children, people often don't consider being a child a part of your social identity. But there's a lot of great philosophers out there who have made excellent arguments to actually argue that, being a child is considered a part of your social identity. So when I talk about hermeneutical injustice and child influencers, I compare the online space to something like the healthcare system. So if you think about the healthcare system, it was created by adults. It's staffed and run by adults. But even further than that, it requires a very specific adult understanding of what it means to be sick, and how you can express that is typically only rendered, okay if you're expressing yourself in an adult manner. So a young child who might very well be sick doesn't have the necessary framework to say, oh, this is what feels bad or wrong, or this is where I don't feel well, or this thing hurts. They're a child. It's due to no fault of their own. They don't have this adult framework of what it means to be sick. They just don't have it. So they can often, be ignored in the healthcare system. And this is also potentially where the testimonial injustice can come in. It's like, oh, you're just a kid, so we're not going to believe you when you say you're feeling this way. So I then compare this sort of different framework that children have when describing their own, illness to the online sphere. If you think about a typical influencer, they're going to be likely over the age of 18, or at least a teenager, who can understand what it means to post something online. Because, the online space is growing and it's vastly different from what it was, even 3 decades ago. So adults have this understanding of what it means to post themselves online and even what it means to post their children online. But, 3, 4, 5-year-olds just don't understand. They don't have this same understanding. So in this way, I think there's a great injustice being done to them by taking advantage of this lack of understanding, this lack of framework that they have. There's one very young kid influencer. There's a clip of her that I cite in my paper where her mom is videoing her in the car, and she says, like, Mama, this woman came up to me. She said she sees my videos on Instagram, but I don't dance on Instagram. I dance in Australia. And it really hits you in that moment. You're like, this child is 3, is being broadcasted to millions, if not billions of people, and doesn't understand what's happening. She might enjoy dancing and being in videos, but it does seem like there's a clear harm there happening because she doesn't have the framework needed to understand as to what it means to be an influencer and what it means to dance online. So that's like kind of the hermeneutical injustice part. The testimonial injustice, I argue a little bit slightly against what Fricker says. Another scholar in epistemic injustice is named Jose Medina, who is brilliant, by the way. He talks about how instances where a credibility excess, so as due to some part of your social identity, you're afforded too much credibility. So Fricker says this sort of thing typically doesn't constitute an epistemic injustice because it typically helps you. It's probably like if you're afforded more credibility than you actually should have, that's, for a lot of people, that's probably like, hey, it's a benefit. I'm not going to question that. But Medina looks at that and says, well, if we look at testimonial injustice in a more holistic and contextual way, a credibility excess can be harmful. Because if you're constantly told, oh, you're so smart, you're so great, you know this, and I'm confident that you know this, you can become pretty arrogant or dogmatic. And I believe him when he claims that. So I look at child influencers who are children in the position of being an influencer, who are often afforded a credibility excess. And in doing so, this is making them more arrogant, more sure of themselves, and can lead them to, believe that they know more about things than they actually do. If you're a kid influencer who talks about dresses and makeup, and so maybe you're constantly getting this affirmation from your fans online of, oh, you're so smart. We believe you, like, you know everything about this, maybe exaggerating a little bit for emphasis here, but I think the point still stands. If one day you go on your TikTok channel and you say something blatantly untrue, like models with freckles never get hired in the fashion industry.
Yeah.
So like maybe you say this, maybe you have a following and then you have loyal fans who are like, well, she said that, it's got to be true. We trust her on her opinions on makeup and dresses. But then maybe you have people in the comments saying, hey, so-and-so, that's actually not true. But what Medina argues, and what I think we see, is that by affording this kid influencer a credibility excess, the audience is actually devaluing their own testimony, saying, well, of course she knows this. She's the expert. This expert is, maybe a 10-year-old. But then in addition to that, they're blocking the exchange of information and knowledge by saying, oh, you commenters who are saying this about, my favorite kid influencer who knows everything about the fashion industry, maybe they're blocking the comments. Maybe they're trying to ban people from the site saying, no, you can't correct her because she's right. She's in this position. It sounds, maybe a little bit far-fetched, but this is actually what we're seeing even with children who are 10 years old. So I argue, a la Medina, that, this credibility excess that child influencers are being afforded is actually harmful, not only to them for being lauded because of this aspect of being an influencer, but it's also causing their audience members to devalue their own testimony and also to dismiss other people because, oh, no, you cannot critique my favorite kid influencer in this way. So I try to analyze kid influencers from both the testimonial and hermeneutical injustice to show that, we understand that there's some harms that are happening, but understanding that there's, an epistemic facet to these harms, I argue, can allow us to try and find some solutions, whether they be legal or financial or even social, that we can pursue these solutions with a better understanding of actually what's happening to these children.
Yeah, wow, this is incredibly interesting. Both interesting and important work, I think, as the internet slowly infiltrates and takes over just about everything.
Yeah.
You talk about solutions. What do we do? How do we work from here? What are next sort of steps?
Yeah, I think that there is a push in some in the legal sector right now. There's a bit of a push in the U.S. Due to some really truly horrific cases of child abuse coming out in the U.S. From parents who are posing their children as influencers. So there are some reactive laws in the states right now that are trying to put in legal protections for specifically the financial situation of child influencers. They're trying to classify them similarly to child actors and saying that there needs to be a trust in place in order to, protect these children on a financial level. But the legal sphere, in the small moves that it's making, is really only addressing the financial concern. There's not a ton of work being done in the legislative sense in order to actually like protect child influencers as a whole. So I sort of lean towards, a social solutions, like social understanding, spreading the word that, hey, this is, has the possibility to be incredibly detrimental. There was one really popular TikTok influencer who I believe at the height of her channel had over 17 million followers, over 600 million likes. Her name was Ren Eleanor, but increasingly her mother was posting her in suggestive situations. And it was, as someone who had stumbled across their content, it was very jarring to see at the time, I think she was 4 or 5. But due to pressure from, people online saying, hey, this is clearly exploitative. You are putting your child in a really bad situation. Her account was actually now put on private, so no one can access the videos of this very young girl anymore. And that was due to truly just social pressure. Like there was nothing that TikTok did to do that. There was nothing that like the law did to cause this to happen. It was truly people online recognizing the potential for harm that was happening, saying, hey, something has to change. We can't allow this to keep happening. So I really think that, having a greater social understanding of what's going on, spreading the word, and, making it clear that, there is potentially something really bad about where we're heading in terms of kidfluencers, especially when there are no legal protections. So I think my main solution is more of like a social consciousness raising of that we're like, let's critically look at what we're consuming and what we're, likes and follows are able to, allow these kids to, again, earn up to millions of dollars for their family, which only convinces their family to keep putting them in these situations. So I think that as audience members, being aware of the potential harms that are being inflicted on the people that we're watching and supporting through views, likes, comments, and follows, I think can really make a big difference because we're seeing it on a small scale with individual influencers then, shutting down their platforms or like choosing not to show their children's faces on camera anymore. So like, I think there's small changes being made, but I think, influencers run on their audiences. Like that's their primary like method to keep going. So I think if audiences are able to understand the harms that are going on, then there is a really good potential for real change.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'm on board with this. Now you mentioned this idea of consciousness raising.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell me a bit about what that is? Is it coming from the audience? Is it coming from the folks who are making the videos?
Yeah, I honestly think a little bit of both. I think it's really easy to sort of, if you scroll on TikTok, I did an experiment when I was, researching child influencers. I made a new TikTok account and I didn't like any videos. I didn't put my preference for anything when, making a new account. And I just started scrolling to see how long it would take for me to see like, a video of a kid. Mm-hmm. And I think I scrolled for maybe 3 minutes and I saw at least 10 videos featuring children. And it's that sort of thing where it's like being engaged in what we're viewing and what we're, what sort of content we're consuming. And I think not to put the burden entirely on the audience, there should be an awareness of what content you're putting out there if you're in the position of an influencer. But I think it's truly just stopping, thinking, is this the type of content I want to be supporting and why? Because if the answer is yes, awesome. You thought about it, you're still good to go on that sort of thing. So, my idea of consciousness raising is just being like aware of what we're supporting and how we're supporting it. Because I think, we all say like, love to doom scroll after a long day of work.
It's so good.
It feels, and, I'm sure there's great psychological research on that sort of thing that I probably can't speak on. But I think there's truly something to be said about being aware of the content we choose to consume and engage with regularly. So I think there's a bit of like the audience being aware of what we're doing, but then also content creators. Like, I think it's really hard to claim the full ignorance argument. If you're a parent selling your child's used dance uniforms online. That's a real thing. Unfortunately, some of this research is a little depressing when you see like sort of like the really dark side of this sort of thing. But, that sort of thing, you can't be like, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
It's really looking at, what you're doing, the kind of people you're catering to. So I don't think it's only content creators need to look at this or only audience needs to look at this. I think it needs to be a sort of collective, let's take a step back, analyze why we're doing this, think for 30 seconds if this is the type of content I want to support in some way. And, then talking about it with other people. Because, I talk to people, I'm like, yeah, I talk about child influencers, and then we talk about it, and it's like, oh, this is worse than I thought. I think that's a lot of ways. And again, going a little bit back to bioethics, why I think like interdisciplinary work and talking with people who have different life experiences than you is so important. Because I might come at a problem from, the philosophy lens one way, but then a friend who's a nurse is going to come at it differently. I have a friend who comes from a different philosophy background who's going to come at it differently. So that sort of thing I think is so important. So again, I feel like this was a very roundabout way to say consciousness raising. We all just need to be a little bit more aware of the sort of things that we're supporting and doing, and also the sort of things we're creating and putting out there on the internet. Because, the internet is kind of forever. So
the digital footprint is very real.
Yes, absolutely.
Very real. And now I'd love to shift gears just a bit, because you were talking about just talking to different people and all these different folks in your program. How have you found the community at McGill?
Yeah, I've honestly really enjoyed getting to know people. I think a part of that is because my undergrad was so small. I was one of 2 people in my year who graduated with a philosophy degree.
Wow, 2 people.
2 people.
Oh my goodness.
So our department was incredibly small, which is wonderful because I got to know the people in it. But also I think there is sometimes a limit to the sort of conversations you can have. Again, I was in philosophy for 4 years with the same people. I had 2 professors at my school who taught me so much, but I didn't have professors who were experts in feminist theory or experts in research ethics. So being able to, talk to people who have completely went to different schools, different backgrounds, even different philosophical interests. Like I've had conversations with people where it's like, wow, I would never think about this as a solution to a problem. So I think that from like an academic level has been so incredibly enjoyable to me. Because listen, I will love to have an academic conversation with anyone.
Yes, we will. Yeah.
Yes, we will. Absolutely. But I feel like we've had conversations like talking about your paper gossip. Never would have occurred to me to think about that. So I think like the academic community is so vibrant. And I think it's been really great, honestly, being in a bigger city. Like there's no shortage of things to do at all. And that's also really exciting, even if it's just, oh, let's try a different cafe this week to go study at together. So I think the community is like alive and bustling, which for me can be a little bit much at times, because I think it's a little intimidating for me to come at. But at the same time, I feel really lucky to have such, an academically focused community who's also willing to, hang out outside of philosophy sometimes as well.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'll ask this, I'll frame it in this way. In terms of living in Montreal, if we were to say roses and thorns, what would be your rose? What would be the most positive thing or your favorite thing, and a thorn of what maybe what's something you want to get to know a bit better or maybe haven't enjoyed as much?
Yeah, I would say starting with my rose, I love living in a walkable city.
Yes.
It's, again, I'm from a small town, and you have to drive literally everywhere. And if you are able to live in a city where you get to walk and use public transportation, like I'm a huge public transportation fan. I love being able to walk places. I love when I'm not going to classes, I can just go walk around the city and explore. And that's something that I absolutely adore being here. There's no shortage of things to do, cafes to try, restaurants to go to. So I genuinely love that. I've been here for almost 4 months now. I don't get tired of the city at night. I think it's utterly beautiful. So I think in that way has been just such a lovely experience for me. And I hope I never get tired of it. I will say sometimes a thorn, and maybe it's like just like the flip side of this same thing, is sometimes there's like maybe a little bit too many options. Where it's like trying to balance between like really wanting to do well in my academics, but also wanting to experience all the things that like Montreal has to offer. That balance can feel a little tricky, because sometimes when I'm like, oh, I have to stay in and study because I want to do well in my class, I'm like, oh, am I missing out on doing this fun thing with people? So I think maybe that could be said about a lot of different places, but I think it's just trying to find the balance of, wanting to do well and enjoy my academic life, and then also wanting to have a social life as well.
Yeah, it is possible to do both.
It is possible.
Shockingly. Oh, well, Jenna, it has been absolutely a delight to have you. Thank you for coming on and sharing all of your experiences with the program and your research interests. So with that saying, thank you for tuning in to the McGill Philosophy Department Podcast. I'm Sarah Turnbull, and today we've had
Jenna Johnston.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Take care.